Napoleon, The Art of War and Power, Maxim 36. When the enemy's army is covered by a river, upon which he holds several Pt7, do not attack in front. This would divide your force and expose you to be turned. Approach the river in an echelon of columns, in such a manner that the leading column shall be the only one the enemy can attack, without offering you his flank. In the meantime, let your light troops occupy the bank, and when you have decided on the point of passage, rush upon it and fling across your bridge. Observe that the point of passage should be always at a distance from the leading echelon, in order to deceive the enemy. Note: if you occupy a town or a village on the bank of a river, opposite to that held by the enemy, it is an advantage to make this spot the crossing point, because it is easier to cover your carriages and reserve artillery, as well as to mask the construction of your bridge, in a town than in the open country. It is also a great advantage to pass a river opposite a village, when the latter is only weakly occupied by the enemy, because as soon as the advanced guard reaches the other side, it carries this post, makes a lodgment, and by throwing up a few defensive works, converts it easily into a tete de pont. By this means, the rest of the army is enabled to effect the passage with facility. Maxim 37. From the moment you are master of a position which commands the opposite bank, facilities are acquired for effecting the passage of the river, above all, if this position is sufficiently extensive to place upon it artillery and force. This advantage is diminished if the river is more than 300 toises, or 600 yards, in breadth. Because the distance being out of the range of grape, it is easy for the troops which defend the passage to line the bank and get under cover. Hence it follows that if the grenadiers ordered to pass the river for the protection of the bridge should reach the other side, they would be destroyed by the fire of the enemy, because his batteries, placed at the distance of 200 toises from the landing, are capable of a most destructive effect, although removed above 500 toises from the batteries of the crossing force. Thus, the advantage of the artillery would be exclusively his. For the same reason, the passage is impracticable unless you succeed in surprising the enemy and are protected by an intermediate island, or unless you are able to take advantage of an angle in the river to establish a crossfire upon his works. In this case, the island or angle forms a natural tete de pont and gives the advantage in artillery to the attacking army. When a river is less than 60 toises, or 120 yards, in breadth, and you have a post upon the other side, the troops which are thrown across derive such advantages from the protection of your artillery that however small the angle may be, it is impossible for the enemy to prevent the establishment of a bridge. In this case, the most skillful generals, when they have discovered the project of their adversary and brought their own army to the point of crossing, usually content themselves with opposing the passage of the bridge by forming a semicircle round its extremity, as round the opening of a defile, and removing it to the distance of 300 or 400 toises from the fire of the opposite side. Note: Frederick observes that the passage of great rivers in the presence of the enemy is one of the most delicate operations in war. Success on these occasions depends on secrecy, on the rapidity of the maneuvers, and the punctual execution of the orders given for the movements of each division. To pass such an obstacle in presence of an enemy, and without his knowledge, it is necessary not only that the previous dispositions should be well conceived, but that they should be executed without confusion. In the campaign of 1705, Prince Eugene of Savoy, wishing to come to the assistance of the Prince of Piedmont, sought for a favorable point at which to force the passage of the Adda, defended at that time by the French army under the command of the Duc de Vendôme. Oh my goodness. Vendôme. Vendome. After having selected an advantageous situation, Prince Eugene erected a battery of 20 pieces of cannon on a position which commanded the entire of the opposite bank and covered his infantry by a line of entrenched parallels constructed on the slope of the declivity. They were working vigorously at the bridge when the Duc de Vendôme appeared with his whole army. At first he seemed determined to oppose its construction, but after having examined the position of Prince Eugene, he judged this to be impracticable. He therefore placed his army out of reach of the prince's batteries, resting both his wings upon the river so as to form a bow, of which the adder was the cord. He then covered himself with entrenchments and abattis. Abattis, there's a footnote here, an abattis, or abattis, Abattis, is a fortification consisting of an obstacle, often made of tree branches, arranged with the sharpened points directed towards the enemy. Abattis. He then covered himself with entrenchments and abattis, and was thus enabled to charge the enemy's columns whenever they debouched from the bridge, and to beat them in detail. Eugene, having reconnoitered the position of the French, considered the passage impossible. He therefore withdrew the bridge and broke up his camp during the night. It was by this maneuver, also, that, in the campaign of 1809, the Archduke Charles compelled the French to reoccupy the Isle of the Lobau, Lobau, after having debouched on the left bank of the Danube. The march of the Archduke Charles was wholly concentric. He menaced Gross Aspern with his right, Essling with his center, and Enzersdorf with his left. His army, with both wings resting on the Danube, formed a semicircle around Essling. Napoleon immediately attacked and broke the center of the Austrians. But after having forced their first line, he found himself arrested by the reserves. In the meantime, the bridges upon the Danube had been destroyed, and several of his corps, with their parks of artillery, were still on the right bank. This disappointment, joined to the favorable position of the Austrians, decided Napoleon to re-enter the Isle of Lobau, where he had previously constructed a line of field works so as to give it all the advantages of a well-entrenched camp. Maxim 38. It is difficult to prevent an enemy supplied with pontoons from crossing a river, when the object of an army which defends the passage is to cover a siege. The moment the general has ascertained his inability is to oppose the passage, he should take measures to arrive before the enemy. At an intermediate position between the river he defends and the place he desires to cover. Note: here we may observe that this intermediate position should be reconnoitered, or rather, well entrenched beforehand, for the enemy will be unable to make an offensive movement against the corps employed in the siege until he has beaten the army of observation, and the latter, under cover of its camp, may always await a favorable opportunity to attack him in flank or in rear. Besides, the army which is once entrenched in this manner has the advantage of being concentrated, while that of the enemy must act in detachments, if he wishes to cover his bridge, and watch the movements of the army of observation, so as to enable him to attack the besieging corps in its lines without being exposed to an attempt on his rear or being menaced with the loss of his bridge. Maxim 39. In the campaign of 1645, Turin was attacked with his army before Philipsburg by a very superior force. There was no bridge here over the Rhine, but he took advantage of the ground between the river and the place to establish his camp. This should serve as a lesson to engineer officers, not merely in the construction of fortresses, but of tiges de pont. A space should always be left between the fortresses and the river, where an army may form and rally without being obliged to throw itself into the place and thereby compromise its security. An army retiring upon Mayence, Mayence, before a pursuing enemy is necessarily compromised. For this reason, because it requires more than a day to pass the bridge, and because the lines of Cassel are too confined to admit an army to remain there without being blocked up. 200 toises should have been left between that place and the Rhine. It is essential that all tiges de pont before great rivers should be constructed upon this principle, otherwise they will prove a very inefficient assistance to protect the passage of a retreating army. Tiges de pont, as laid down in our schools, are of use only for small rivers, the passage of which is comparatively short. Note: Marshal Saxe, in the campaign of 1741, having passed the Moldau, Moldau, in quest of a detached corps of 14,000 men, which was about to throw itself into Prague, left 1,000 infantry upon that river, with orders to entrench themselves upon a height directly opposite the tiges de pont. By this precaution, the marshal secured his retreat and also the facility of repassing the bridge without disorder. by rallying his divisions between the entrenched height and the Pt de Pont. Were these examples unknown to the generals of modern times, or are they disposed to think such precautions superfluous? Maxim 40. Fortresses are equally useful in offensive and defensive warfare. It is true they will not in themselves arrest an army, but they are an excellent means of retarding, embarrassing, weakening, and annoying a victorious enemy. Note: the brilliant success of the Allied armies in the campaign of 1814 has given to many military men a false idea of the real value of fortresses. The formidable bodies which crossed the Rhine and the Alps at this period were enabled to spare large detachments to blockade the strong places that covered the frontiers of France, without materially affecting the numerical superiority of the army which marched upon the capital. This army was in a condition, therefore, to act without the fear of being menaced in its line of retreat. But at no period of military history were the armies of Europe so combined before, or governed so entirely by one common mind in the attainment of a single object. Under these circumstances, the line of fortresses which surrounds France was rendered unavailable during this campaign. But it would be very imprudent, therefore, to conclude that a frontier guarded by numerous fortresses may be passed with impunity, or that battles may be fought with these places in your rear, without previously besieging, or at least investing them with sufficient forces. And that will do it for this recording.